The ladies of the Garnet Pavilion constantly changed their clothes and makeup, and they all had similar builds. He knew their names, but he could never quite match them to their faces. Instead, he distinguished them by subtle details, like who had a mole or whose eyes were a certain shape. Jinchi reached out, grasped Lulan's fan between his fingers and flung it away. "Well, I never," one of the ladies in waiting cried. Consort Lulan turned away from Jinchi as if she were afraid of him. Her ladies moved to position themselves between him and her. It was a complete show of loyalty to their mistress, or so it appeared. Jinchi only had to glance at the eunuchs who had come with him. They pulled the women aside, clearing his path to Lulan. He took her shoulder, not gently, and forced her to face him. Even under her makeup he could see her flushing red. He said, "I seem to recall Consort Lulan having 7 ladies in waiting. As Shishu's coddled daughter, she had no fewer than 50 servants with her when she entered the rear palace." Jinchi held Lulan in place. He wiped away the makeup around her eyes with his fingers, revealing large double-fold eyes. Now, what had been the name of the woman with the mole on her temple? He believed her name was Saurin. Or no, was it Renpu? Jinchi smiled, very deliberately not allowing any anger into his face. The lady in waiting who had transformed herself into Consort Lulan went from flushed to deathly pale, and she began to tremble. Mas, one of the other ladies in waiting, moved once more to get between them, but Jinchi simply looked at her. She winced visibly and stepped back again. Where is the real Consort Lulan? Had she planned all this from the beginning? The army of servants and the ladies in waiting who looked like her, along with the ever-changing dazzling costumes, all helped so no one would notice if the consort changed places with one of her women. Had that been her goal all along? And where was the real Lulan now? Where did she go? Jinchi asked. The woman pretending to be Lulan shivered, but she did not say a word. Jinchi tightened his grip. Where did she go? He asked the question for the 3rd time. The woman who had tried to step in leaned closer, hugging the fake consort protectively. She looked at Jinchi. "I am very sorry, sir, but I swear she truly does not know." He had not noticed before because of their matching outfits, but this woman was several years older than the fake consort. "Please have mercy." The woman, deeply distressed, looked at the fake consort's feet. The long hem of the skirt was damp. Droplets could be seen running down the silent woman's legs and dripping off her toes. This terrified the fake Lulan so much that she lost control of her bladder. Jinchi released the fake Lulan's chin. Her eyes widened. Her pupils were dilated, her breathing was harsh, and she was still shaking. The pale skin of her chin and neck showed clear signs of where Jinchi had grabbed her. It was a display of violence almost unthinkable for the eunuch Jinchi. Far too unrefined, too uncivilized for him. Admitting the daughters of powerful officials to the rear palace had advantages for the emperor. Yes, the officials could look forward to potentially having a grandchild sit on the throne if their daughter bore the sovereign's offspring, but it could also tie their hands. For many parents, not all but many, their daughter is the apple of their eye. The birdcage that was the rear palace effectively held those precious girls hostage. Considering how Shishu had pushed to get Lulan into the rear palace, he clearly doted on her. His daughter became a high consort. The emperor was obliged to treat her with a certain level of respect, but she was likewise expected to conduct herself to certain standards. Already, Jinchi had stopped thinking of her as Consort Lulan. She had violated those standards. The lady in waiting from earlier said solemnly, she said she wasn't coming back. The woman identified herself as Lulan's chief lady in waiting. She answered Jinchi's questions for the false consort, who could barely breathe, let alone speak. Jinchi learned that she had been chosen to act as Lulan's body double because she looked the most like her. The woman did not fully understand the situation or what her role meant. She believed the request to impersonate her mistress was simply another of Lulan's passing fancies. Jinchi made a fist with one hand. He had been mistaken. He now understood that he had approached the situation incorrectly, not what the eunuch Jinchi with his gentle smile would typically do. He hadn't been calm enough to think of another way to approach the situation, so she wasn't coming back. This presumably meant she had fled the rear palace. That was a serious offense. In some cases it was punishable by death. It was even worse when the crime was committed by a high consort. It was like a courtesan cutting her ties with her house, the apothecary's daughter had said once. Jinshi smiled to himself. It was just like her to compare the place where the emperor's children were born to a common pleasure district. The girl. Someone else remained unfound. Knowing Maomao, she might have gone willingly. However, it was more likely she had been given no other choice. But why had this happened? He still had many questions. He interrogated the chief lady in waiting thoroughly, but he was left shaking his head. He could always have her tortured, but he did not think it would help him. He believed her eyes showed she was telling the truth. He had the ladies in waiting of the Garnet Pavilion, the maids, and the eunuchs, anyone connected with Lulan, confined to one place. The classroom was about the right size. At the same time, eunuchs were doing the tedious work of checking every woman in the rear palace, just for good measure. So far, they hadn't found anyone who resembled Lulan. Jinshi knew he was in no shape to deal with consort Jaikaiu's delivery. Much against his wishes, he charged Gaeshan with the job. Jinshi was in his office, holding his head in his hands. Basin was with him, perhaps because it was a state of emergency. At that moment he was reporting not long ago, Master Lakan charged the rear palace, attempting to force his way in. Jinshi's face was tight. He didn't think he could have smiled if he'd wanted to. It was an unbelievable thing to do, yet the man with the monocle had done it. Word must have gotten out somehow, Basin said, making a face like he was chewing on something bitter. And Shishu's current whereabouts are still unknown. It was clear why Basin no longer referred to the man with any title of honor. His daughter Lulan had fled the rear palace, and as her father, he would be treated as a traitor to the emperor. They had also received a report on Shenel's status after drinking the alcohol. She had survived somehow, but she hadn't yet regained consciousness. They were told she had been a personal acquaintance of Tehu. That was no doubt how she had been brought into this conspiracy against the throne. With the former emperor gone, Jinshi suspected her rage had turned against the rear palace generally. They did not even know who else at the clinic might have been involved. Perhaps those people had gone along quietly because they, like Shenel, had been the former ruler's victims. Jinshi did not have time to waste. He wanted to go flying from the rear palace and hunt down Lulan. He did not have enough information yet. To go running off now would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. He thought he should first find out what Shishu was doing. He already had someone working on that, however. Jinshi was left with nothing to do but pace back and forth in his office. Master Jinshi, Basin said, glancing in his direction. A visitor had arrived outside the office, and Basin seemed to be trying to remind him that it wouldn't do for him to be seen in such a pathetic state. Jinshi bowed to necessity and sat pretending he was calm. Basin glanced at a mirror. The mirror was positioned to conceal what was inside the room. Then he awaited their visitor with a look of some perplexity. A simple official entered the room. This person was a height that might have been called petite if he had been a woman. He wore round spectacles. Aside from somewhat unkempt hair and narrow fox-like eyes, there was little obviously remarkable about the young man. He looked oddly familiar, though. The young man put his hands in his sleeves and bowed. Jinshi thought he spotted something tucked in the young man's sash. When he looked a little closer, he realized it was an abacus. "A pleasure to meet you. My name is Kan Lahan." With that supremely simple self-introduction, the young man grinned. That name so that was who he resembled. No one would have known who he was had he identified himself as a member of the House of Kan, for in the whole country of Li there were only about 20 family names. People often used courtesy names to indicate their families. These names were frequently passed down from generation to generation. Besides family courtesy names, the imperial family had also given courtesy names to various houses since ancient times. For the man standing before them, La was his courtesy name. There were only 2 people within the outer court who used that name, Lakan and his adopted nephew. The only other person who might possibly be considered was a man who had recently arrived at the rear palace as a physician, Lumen. Lua was the same character as La. This raised the question of what Lakan's adopted son was doing here. "Did you need something with me?" Jinshi outranked Lakan in the official hierarchy. Therefore, the young man's sudden appearance could be considered rude. However, Jinshi knew that using his rank and making scary faces would not help him in this case. And no matter his station, Some officials treated him with less respect because he was a eunuch. I thought you might want to see this, sir. Lahan took a scroll from his sleeve and gave it to Basin. Basin inspected the scroll, then handed it to Jinchi. Jinchi decided to take a look, trusting that a delivery from Lakan's son might be significant. He undid the string tying the scroll shut and unrolled it. Then he looked at it in amazement. What do you think, sir, if I may ask? Lahan was still grinning, a deeply self-satisfied and rather unpleasant expression. However, the contents of the scroll fully justified his smugness. It was a list of words and numbers, but depending on how one looked at it, it was also something else. This is something my adoptive father recently instructed me to look into. I don't think he was at all happy not knowing where the Faithful were coming from. Anyhow, I did some sniffing around in connection with the officials who were recently punished and discovered a most intriguing pattern. The scroll was a record of receipts. It was the sort of thing someone connected to the board, overseeing the national treasury, could easily view. Even officials with other positions could see it if they followed the correct procedures. I thought it would be simplest to show you a primary source. Granted, this is just a selection I made. There is quite a lot of it to parse otherwise. Excerpt or not, he had arranged the numbers so that even a non-specialist like Jinchi could understand them, and they revealed that over the past several years, the expenditures of one government organ in particular had grown larger and larger. Interesting, isn't it? These past several years, there has been neither drought nor a plague of insects, and yet the price of grain has risen steadily. Why do you suppose that is? I thought it was most strange, so I examined the market price over the same period. It seems the price of grain was the steadiest of just about any commodity. He was clearly building to something. The price of something else had also risen month by month, along with the cost of grain. Lahan said there is something else. For some reason, the price of iron has been creeping up as well. Here you can see the price of metals all over the country rising. Perhaps they are building a colossal statue somewhere. Jinchi understood what Lahan was suggesting. He set down the scroll and looked at the young man. He certainly shared his shrewdness with his adoptive father. The price of grain might not sound very important, but there was a great deal at stake. A small increase in price would mean a large rise in value. Lahan was suggesting that someone might be keeping the difference for themselves. As for the increase in the price of metal, that implied a rise in demand. This could be caused when someone building a monument to display their power, or some other highly visible project, started gathering material from all over. Even stew pots and farm equipment could be taken and melted down. However, there were other reasons the price might increase. Lahan said, I am capable of examining the circulation of currency over these past years more closely. This includes where it seems to concentrate. Exactly what Jinchi had been hoping to hear. It was almost as if this was precisely what he'd come here to say. It seemed to Jinchi that there was a request in Lahan's gaze. That was no doubt why he had brought this scroll to Jinchi. Men like him never did anything unless it somehow served them. And what do you want in exchange? Jinchi asked bluntly. Lahan's expression softened as if he'd simply been waiting for Jinchi to ask. He took a piece of paper from his sleeve. He looked somewhat reluctant as he did so. Perhaps you would be so kind as to consider this amount. The paper was a bill for the repair of a wall at the rear of the palace. Jinchi could only assume it was one of Lakan's people who had burst through. Chapter 13 is titled Festival. Maomao was given a traditional outfit to wear. It was a pure white jacket and a red skirt. She covered her face with her fox mask. She also carried a lantern decorated with pampas grass and rice stalks. She was told that, dressed as she was, they would walk to the shrine at the edge of town. The men wore blue clothes. The children had bundles of rice and pampas grass draped behind them, looking like tails. These people worshipped Kozan, a fox deity. The fox was a spirit of abundance, and it was venerated in many places. It was only natural to have a major festival in autumn when so much came from the land. Maomao heard the chiming of a bell. Someone stood beside her, and they had outlined the eyes of their mask in a way that looked faintly ridiculous, despite it being a fox mask. The usual color to paint around the eyes of a mask like this was red, but this person had used green. The corners of the eyes seemed to droop down somehow. It looks more like a tanuki, Maomao commented to the mask's owner, Shisui. Perhaps she was better at drawing bugs than beasts. The thought brought an unexpected smile to Maomao's face. She said to herself, "Guess this is hardly the time." But she also knew that denying herself a pleasant thought wouldn't help her under the circumstances. Shisui said, "You remind me of a cat, Maomao." Maomao had a bell on her hair stick. It jingled whenever she laughed. The sound was strangely like the bugs she used to collect. She could see a small bug carved from a jewel right on the end of the hair stick. The girl really did like insects. "Here, Maomao, make sure it's nice and tight," she said. Then she snugged down the string of Maomao's mask. The string went right over where Maomao had tied her hair, though. Shisui couldn't quite get it to stay. Wait, I will try again. Sit down." She helped Maomao sit on the railing of the inn. Then she brushed Maomao's hair aside and retied it. "It needs something else. It looks so lonely with just a hair tie." "I do not mind. Oh, I know, I will lend you a hair stick. I have one shaped like a spider's web. It's really cute." Maomao wished there was some way to politely refuse. She dug into the folds of her robes and managed to come up with the hair stick Jinchi had given her. It looked plain, but the quality was fine. Maomao was content to use a simple hair tie and often left it in her robe. "Use this if you would." Or Maomao did not need to turn around to imagine the pout on Shisui's face. She pressed the hair stick into the other girl's palm. "Gee, this is nice, Maomao," Shisui commented. "Someone gave it to me," she replied. They had given it to her without much ceremony, that was true. "What if I asked you to give it to me? Would you do it?" After a moment's pause, Maomao said carefully, "I'm afraid not." She had considered simply handing it off to someone once before, but hadn't. If she had then or did now, she could barely imagine what the eunuch impersonator would say. She knew he would be angry, whatever it was. "You would think I just needed to keep my mouth shut." But Jinchi was oddly skilled at reading Maomao's expressions. They had known each other for a fair amount of time, and he was quite sensitive to slight changes in her face. Maomao felt she wasn't very deft at controlling her facial muscles. She thought all of her looks manifested as little more than scowls. Perhaps she could give Shisui the hair stick. If she never made it back to the capital alive, she wouldn't have to worry about the consequences. They're all done. Shisui patted Maomao's shoulder and she stood up. Her hair was tucked behind her right ear, which made the mask much easier to put on. When she looked out at the village through the small eyeholes, the whole world seemed different. Perhaps it was because it was night, or maybe it was the wavering flames of the torches, but the people walking around in their masks really did look like foxes, except for the one standing next to her, who still looked like a green-eyed tanuki. Shisui was not the only one who had painted her mask in green. They crossed paths with a green-eyed fox every once in a while. Most of them were men. Their blue trousers were a clear sign. Maomao began to wonder if the green eyes held some sort of significance. "It's otherworldly, isn't it?" Shisui said. "Aha, that much was certainly true. You're not freaked out." "What would be the point of being freaked out?" She agreed that it was unearthly. She was wearing wooden clogs instead of her normal shoes. They clacked with each step she took. A bell was ringing and an owl hooted from the forest. All the noises came together, creating something uncanny. She was almost convinced she could hear foxes yowling in the night. With the foxes' voices in the background, they walked among the lantern plants, the rice stalks, and the firelight. They emerged from the forest and made their way along a single narrow path. The path wound among the rice paddies. Their progress was accompanied by an occasional unpleasant hissing. This sound came from insects incinerating themselves as they flew into the torches. The torches were placed at intervals along the path. There appeared to be many of them. "Lots of grasshoppers this year," Shisui said. This was exactly why the festival had to be so lavish. It was the wish the festival carried. "Around here we venerate a fox deity who brings abundance." "You know why? No, why? Ring, ring." Shisui's bell chimed as she walked and talked. There was once a tribe of native peoples who lived in this area. Then people from a different country came from the west. The locals did not simply accept them immediately, of course. Few people were so naive. Most villages chased them out and wanted them to go away. But a few villages, a very small number, took the newcomers in. These people from the West knew things, and some people here saw the value of that knowledge. The newcomers knew how to make fields more productive and how to exterminate harmful insects. Valuable knowledge indeed. However, many people still did not welcome them. Around the time the newcomers settled down and began to have children with the locals, their neighbors attacked, seeking to steal their fields. After several such attacks, the people built a hidden village so that their children and grandchildren would be safe. They discovered a place where hot springs bubbled up from the earth, and they built there. This was likely the village where Maomao now was. She thought the foxes represented people from that foreign land. It was not unusual to refer to people from other tribes as if they were animals. The deity, or perhaps deities of this village, was the ancestor of these people. The villagers were themselves fox gods. People say the foxes here are white foxes.